The names appeared on the pillar of light one by one, climbing upward from the bottom like a ladder built for giants. 6,012 cadets stood in the grand atrium of the Thalran Prime War College, the most famous military academy in the known galaxy, and every single one of them watched the holographic rankings burn into the air above their heads. Species from over 400 worlds had sent their finest children here to learn war, to learn command, to learn how to bend the galaxy to their will, and every year the Academy sorted them on the very first day like grain from chaff. The ranking was based on everything a cadet was born with: the combat ability of their species, their psionic index, their physical durability, their academic history, the reputation of their bloodline, and the number that appeared beside each name was supposed to tell the galaxy exactly how much that cadet was worth. At the very top of the pillar, glowing in bright gold, was a name that surprised no one. Viral Sonterk, rank 1. He stood near the front of the crowd, towering over most of the cadets around him, his 4 arms folded across a chest that looked like it had been carved from pale stone and threaded with veins of soft blue light that pulsed beneath his skin like a second heartbeat. Viral was Keshari, and the Keshari were what the galaxy thought of when it thought of warriors, a species 12,000 years into their civilization, tall and powerful, and gifted with a low-level telepathy that let them read the surface thoughts of weaker minds. His family name was legendary, his combat record in the junior leagues was perfect, and his psionic index was among the highest ever recorded for a first-year cadet. He looked up at his name at the top of the pillar and felt nothing in particular because he had expected nothing less. At the very bottom of the pillar, so low it was almost touching the floor, was a name that made several cadets nearby squint and whisper. Ren Vasquez, rank 6,012. Dead last. A few cadets laughed, not in a mean way but in the way people laugh when they see something that does not make sense, like a fish walking into a classroom. Some of the elder species physically stepped back when they realized what the name meant. There was a human in the academy. Ren stood near the back of the atrium, and she was easy to miss if you were not looking for her, which nobody was. She was short by the standards of most species present, with dark hair pulled back tight and dark eyes that moved slowly across the room like she was counting exits. She wore the same gray cadet uniform as everyone else, but on her it looked like borrowed clothes, like the academy had not expected to dress someone her size. She came from Earth's fringe colonies, the rough, resource-starved frontier worlds on the outer edge of human space, where people fought raiders and alien wildlife, and sometimes each other just to see the next sunrise. She had no famous family, and no engineered genetics, and no psionic ability whatsoever, and the only reason she was standing in this atrium at all was because of an old open admission clause buried deep in the Union's charter that the Galactic Council had been pressured into honoring 3 years ago. She looked at her name at the bottom of the pillar, and her face did not change at all. A tall insectoid cadet standing near her leaned down and said something in a language she did not understand, but the tone was clear enough, pity mixed with amusement. Ren did not respond. She simply looked at the pillar and memorized the name at the top. Later that afternoon, she was assigned her quarters, and the word quarters was doing a lot of heavy lifting because what she actually received was a converted storage room on the lowest deck of the residential ring. The bed was a thin pad on a metal shelf, and the lighting flickered every few seconds, and there was a smell that suggested the room had recently housed chemical supplies rather than a living being. Her equipment was old, 2 generations behind what the upper-ranked cadets received, and her training group assignment placed her with the other bottom-tier cadets, a collection of species the Academy had accepted, but clearly did not expect to succeed. There was a Grith named Pip, a small 6-legged creature covered in soft sensor hairs who flinched every time someone spoke above a whisper. There was a Milok, a burrowing species with powerful forelimbs and no eyes, who navigated entirely by vibration. There were Davi and Luri, and others whose names the galaxy had mostly forgotten. None of them expected to be here long. On her second evening, Wren was summoned to meet her assigned academic advisor, a Droon professor named Overseer Keloth, who had been teaching at the academy for over 60 years, and looked like every single one of those years had personally offended him. Keloth was a heavy-set amphibian species with gray-green skin and 4 small eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on his wide face. And when Wren walked into his office, he did not stand or greet her or offer her a seat. He simply looked at her with all 4 eyes and said, "You will not graduate." Wren stood in the doorway and waited. "Humans never do," Keloth continued, his voice flat and tired like he was reading from a script he had memorized long ago. "In the 30 years since your species was admitted to the Union, 11 humans have attended this academy and none have completed the program. And most did not survive past the first term, not because anyone killed them, but because the curriculum is designed for species with capabilities your kind simply does not possess." He folded his thick hands on his desk. "I am telling you this as a kindness," he said, "so that you can make your decision with clear eyes rather than false hope." Wren looked at him for a long moment, and whatever Keloth expected to see on her face, defeat, anger, tears, defiance, he did not find it. Her expression was the same as it had been in the atrium, the same as it had been in the storage room that was now her home, the same calm and quiet blankness that was not emptiness, but something more like patience, the kind of patience that came from spending years in places where showing your emotions was a luxury that could get you killed. "When is the first combat trial?" she asked. Keloth blinked 3 of his 4 eyes. "The open exhibition is in 6 days, he said slowly, "but I would strongly advise against." "Thank you, Overseer." She turned and walked out before he could finish. 6 days later, the combat exhibition sign-up list was posted on the Academy network, and cadets across the station began entering their names and selecting opponents, and most of them chose carefully, picking rivals close to their own rank to ensure a competitive but manageable fight. The system required each challenger to type in the name of their chosen opponent, and when Wren sat down at the terminal in her storage room quarters and pulled up the entry form, she did not hesitate. She typed a name she had memorized on her very first day. Viral Sonterk, rank 1. She submitted the challenge and closed the terminal and sat in the flickering light of her tiny room, and if anyone had been watching her face at that moment, they would have seen something that had not been there before. The smallest ghost of a smile. Somewhere in the upper decks of the academy, in a private suite 10 times the size of Wren's room, Viral Sonterk's personal terminal chimed with a notification he had never received before in his entire life. A challenge from the very bottom of the list, from a species he had barely thought about, from a name he did not recognize and would not forget. The Academy held its breath and waited for what would come next. The news moved through the Academy like fire through dry grass. By the next morning, every cadet on Thaurin Prime knew that the last-ranked student had challenged the first-ranked student to open combat, and the reaction split cleanly into 2 camps, those who thought it was a joke and those who thought it was a death wish. Betting pools opened within hours, and the odds on Wren were so long that some bookmakers refused to take the wager at all, because paying out on a 4,000-to-1 bet would bankrupt their entire operation. In the upper-tier common rooms where the elite cadets gathered, the challenge was treated as an embarrassment rather than a threat. Viral's inner circle, a group of high-ranked cadets from the oldest and most powerful species in the Union, urged him to decline. "Fighting a human would be degrading," said one of them, a crystalline Shareth whose body chimed softly when she moved. "You would gain nothing from it, and it would lower your standing to even acknowledge." "I will not refuse a public challenge," Viral said. And that was the end of the discussion. He did not say it out of respect for Ren or out of curiosity about what she might do. He said it because his pride was a living thing inside him, vast and ancient and fed by 12,000 years of Keshari supremacy, and that pride simply would not allow him to look afraid of anything, least of all a human. He planned to end the fight in seconds. While Viral trained in the elite combat halls with sparring partners who moved like water and struck like lightning, Ren did something that none of the other cadets would have thought to do. She went to the archive. The Academy's central archive was a massive data repository containing centuries of recorded combat footage from every species in the Union, and Ren sat in a quiet corner of the lowest level and watched every single piece of footage she could find on Keshari fighting techniques. She watched how they used their forearms, the upper pair for striking, the lower pair for grappling and balance, and she noted the rhythmic patterns in their movement, the way they shifted their weight through their hips in a rolling motion that gave their strikes tremendous power, but created a tiny gap in their center of gravity during the transition. She pulled up Viral's personal match history and watched all 47 of his recorded fights, and she watched each one 3 times, once at normal speed, once at half speed, and once frame by frame. She did not take notes because she did not need to. Everything she saw went into a place inside her mind that had been built by years of survival on the fringe, a place where information about threats was stored and sorted and filed away until the moment it was needed. On the fringe colonies, Ren had not learned to fight in academies or training halls. She had learned in back alley cage matches, where the rules changed every night, and the only constant was that the person still standing at the end got to eat. She had learned by fighting things bigger than her and faster than her and meaner than her, and she had survived not because she was the strongest, but because she watched and she learned, and she adapted faster than anything she had ever faced. Pip, the small Grith cadet with the 6 legs and the nervous tremor, found her in the archive on the 3rd day and asked her what she was doing. "Studying," Ren said without looking up. "Studying what?" Pip asked. "How he loses." Pip's sensor hairs stood straight up, which in Grith body language meant either extreme fear or extreme excitement, and in this case it was probably both. "He has never lost," Pip said quietly. "Everyone has never lost," Ren said, "until they do." The day of the exhibition arrived, and the arena was full. The combat floor was a shifting multi-terrain surface that could simulate jungle and desert and tundra and open water, and above it rose tiered seating for over 4,000 spectators, and every seat was taken, and the overflow crowd watched on projected screens throughout the academy. Faculty members lined the upper observation deck, and among them Overseer Keloth sat with his thick arms crossed and all 4 of his eyes fixed on the arena floor with an expression that might have been dread. Viral entered first. He walked onto the combat floor like he owned it, because in every way that mattered he did, and his bioluminescent veins were pulsing bright blue-white, and his forearms were loose and ready, and he was radiating a low-level telepathic pressure that rolled off him in waves and made the weaker-willed cadets in the front rows lean back in their seats without knowing why. The crowd roared for him. Ren entered second. She walked in wearing standard-issue combat gear that was slightly too large for her, and she did not glow and she did not radiate, and the crowd went quiet in a way that was not respectful but pitiful, the way people go quiet when they see something small walk into a place where it clearly does not belong. The combat signal sounded. Viral moved first, closing the distance between them in 2 explosive strides, his upper right arm cocked back for a strike that had ended 30 fights before this one, and he was fast, terrifyingly fast for something his size, a blur of pale skin and blue light. Ren moved wrong. That was the only way to describe it. She dodged, but not in any direction that made sense to Keshari combat logic, stumbling sideways at an angle that looked like panic but took her just outside the arc of his strike. and Viral's telepathic sense reached for her mind to predict her next move, and found nothing useful because the human mind was chaos, a storm of layered contradictory impulses and half-formed thoughts and noise. So much noise that trying to read it was like trying to drink from a waterfall. He swung again and she ducked at a weird angle, and he swung again and she staggered backward, and to anyone watching it looked like she was barely surviving, like she was a leaf being blown around by a hurricane. But Ren was not panicking. She was reading him. Every swing he threw told her something, the way his weight rolled through his hips, the timing gap between his upper and lower arms, the way he favored his primary right arm for power strikes and used his lower left arm for balance adjustment, the subtle hitch in his breathing when he committed to a full-force blow. She was mapping him the way she had mapped every opponent she had ever faced, building a model of his body and his habits and his weaknesses in real time, and she just needed him to keep swinging long enough for the picture to be complete. His upper left arm caught her across the ribs. The impact was enormous, and she went down hard, and the crowd gasped, and blood appeared on her lip where she had bitten through it, and the referee's hand moved toward the match stop signal. Ren got back up. Viral hit her again, a sweeping strike from his lower right arm that caught her shoulder and spun her sideways, and she hit the ground again, and this time the crowd was silent because they were watching something they did not fully understand. Ren got back up again, and this time there was something on her face that had not been there before, a smile, small and sharp and utterly calm, the smile of someone who had found exactly what she was looking for. Viral lunged again with the same combination that had ended his last 12 fights, upper right to lower left to upper right again, and Ren did something that no opponent had ever done to him in 47 recorded matches. She stepped into the attack. Not backward, not sideways, but forward, directly into the gap between his upper strike and his lower arm transition, the half-second window she had been waiting 3 days to find, and she drove her entire body into his center of gravity and got underneath his arms and wrapped herself around his primary right arm and torqued her hips and executed a joint lock that came from a fighting style that was old when humanity first left Earth. A grappling technique born in the dust and desperation of a species that had always been smaller and weaker than the things trying to kill it. Viral had never felt anything like it. His own arm was being used as a lever against his own body, and the human was small, but she was positioned perfectly, using his weight and his momentum against him, and his telepathy was screaming useless noise, and his lower arms could not reach her at the angle she had chosen, and his primary right arm was bending in a direction it was not designed to go. Something in his arm cracked. Viral hit the ground. The arena went so silent that Ren could hear the hum of the station's life support systems. The referee called the match. Ren stood over the first-ranked cadet in the academy, bleeding from her temple and bruised across half her body, breathing hard but breathing steady, and she looked down at Viral Sonterk as he lay on the ground cradling his arm and staring up at her with an expression that no one in the arena had ever seen on a Keshari face. It was not anger and it was not pain. It was shock, pure and absolute and world-shaking. The shock of a being who had been told since birth that he was the top of every chain that mattered, staring up at the bottom of the list and realizing for the first time that the list might be wrong. The scoreboard flickered. Ren's rank did not change because the system had no protocol for what had just happened. But as she walked off the arena floor, limping slightly, 4,000 cadets watched her go, and not one of them was laughing anymore. Every single one of them now knew her name. The system did what systems always do when something threatens them. It pushed back. Within 2 days of Ren's victory in the arena, the Keshari diplomatic delegation filed a formal protest with the Academy's governing council. And the language of the protest was careful and precise, but the meaning underneath was raw and ugly. They claimed that Ren had used uncivilized techniques outside the boundaries of sanctioned combat methodology, which was a polished way of saying that she had fought like a human instead of fighting like everyone else. And in the eyes of the elder species, that was almost the same thing as cheating. The protest carried weight because the Keshari carried weight, and within a week, the Academy's administration had convened a special session and produced a new regulation that nobody had asked for but everyone understood. Cadets could now only challenge opponents within 500 ranks of their own position. The rule was written in neutral language and applied to everyone equally on paper, but every cadet in the academy knew exactly who it was designed to cave. Commandant Dreth announced the regulation change personally during the morning assembly, standing at the front of the grand atrium with his massive armored body gleaming under the lights, and he was Torvon, an ancient crustacean species built like a fortress and just as immovable, and he had run this academy for 40 years, and he had seen a lot of cadets come and go, and he did not like surprises. He looked out over the assembled cadets, and his eyes found Ren in the back rows, and he held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds before moving on, and in those 2 seconds, there was a message that did not need words. You got lucky once, and it will not happen again. Ren's ranking was also placed under administrative review, which meant it was frozen, which meant she could not advance through the challenge system, no matter how many opponents she defeated within her permitted range. The ceiling was locked and the walls were closing in, and the academy had made its position clear. The human had been entertaining, but the entertainment was over. Ren did not protest. She did not complain or file appeals, or speak to anyone about the unfairness of what had been done. She simply shifted. If the combat challenge path was closed, she would take every other path available, and the academy had more metrics than fighting. There were tactical simulations and academic examinations and leadership exercises and strategic planning courses, and none of these had rank restrictions, because nobody had ever imagined that the lowest-ranked cadet would be a threat in a classroom. They imagined wrong. Ren began climbing the academic rankings with a speed that made her professors uncomfortable, not because she was the smartest person in any given room, but because she approached every problem the same way she had approached viral in the arena. She studied it, she found the assumptions it was built on, and she broke those assumptions open like shells to get at the meat inside. In tactical simulations, she consistently chose strategies that the scoring system did not anticipate, approaches that were technically suboptimal by conventional military doctrine, but devastatingly effective in practice. And the simulation graders kept having to manually review her scores because the automated system could not figure out how to classify what she was doing. Meanwhile, something strange was happening in the lower ranks. The other bottom-tier cadets, the ones who had been dumped into Ren's training group and forgotten, were starting to win. It began with Pip. The little Grith had spent the first 2 weeks of the term flinching at every loud noise and apologizing for existing, but Ren had started working with Pip in the evenings, not teaching combat but teaching observation, teaching the Grith to use the extraordinary sensory abilities that the ranking system had valued at nearly 0. The system says your species is weak because you cannot fight, Ren told Pip one evening in the cramped common room that the bottom-tier cadets shared. But you can feel vibrations through 3 walls and detect chemical changes in the air from 50 meters and process sensory data faster than any scanner on the station. So tell me, Pip, who decided that fighting was the only thing that mattered. Pip's sensor hairs rippled in a pattern Ren had learned to recognize as deep thought. The people who are good at fighting, Pip said quietly. Now you understand the whole game, Ren said. She did the same thing with the others. The Milok who could burrow through solid ground but had been scored as nearly useless because the combat metrics did not include tunneling. The Davi who could operate in total darkness with perfect spatial awareness but were ranked low because the standard training environments were always fully lit. The Luri whose perfect eidetic memory was classified as a passive trait rather than a combat asset. Ren did not try to make any of them into something they were not. Instead, she built training exercises around what they already were and showed them how to use their own abilities as weapons. And one by one, the cadets in the lowest training group started winning sparring matches against opponents ranked hundreds of places above them. The Academy noticed, and the Academy did not like it. In the upper tiers, Viral Sonterk was having a problem he had never experienced before. He could not stop thinking about the fight. His arm had healed, Keshari physiology repaired bone damage quickly. But something else had not healed, something inside his understanding of himself, and his place in the world that Ren had cracked open just as surely as she had cracked his joint. His family contacted him through the diplomatic channel and told him to put the incident behind him, to dismiss it publicly as a fluke, an anomaly, a trick that would not work twice, and Viral said the right words to them, but privately he could not make himself believe it. Because he had felt her in that fight, not through telepathy, which had been useless, but through the physical reality of combat, and what he had felt was not luck. It was something precise and patient and terrifyingly adaptive, something that had watched him and learned him and taken him apart using his own patterns against him, and he needed to understand what that something was. So he did something that would have horrified his family if they had known. He went to the archive and began studying human combat history. What he found kept him awake for 3 nights. Humans had been fighting each other for their entire existence as a species, and every time one group developed a fighting style, another group developed a counter to it, and then a counter to the counter, and then a counter to that, layering technique upon technique upon technique in an endless arms race of violence that spanned thousands of years, and every environment their planet had to offer. They had martial arts designed for striking and martial arts designed to defeat strikers and martial arts that combined both and martial arts that threw out everything and started from scratch. And the sheer volume of innovation was staggering, because it meant that humans did not just learn to fight. They learned to fight against fighting itself, endlessly iterating, endlessly adapting, treating combat not as a fixed discipline, but as a living problem that was never fully solved. No other species in the Union had anything like it. The Keshari had perfected their combat doctrine 4,000 years ago, and had not significantly changed it since because it worked, and because they had never encountered anything that forced them to evolve. Ren had not beaten Viral because she was stronger or faster or more gifted. She had beaten him because she came from a species that treated defeat not as an ending but as data, as fuel, as the raw material for becoming something new. Viral closed the archive files and sat in the dark of his quarters and felt something he had never felt toward a human before, not friendship, not warmth, but a cold, clear respect, the kind a predator feels when it realizes it has been hunting something that hunts back. Elsewhere on the station, in a small office that was not listed on any official directory, a woman sat in front of a screen displaying Ren's complete academy file, grades, combat footage, social interactions, biometric data, everything. The woman's name was Marin, and she was listed in the Academy's records as a minor Union liaison officer assigned to oversee human integration concerns. But her actual role was considerably more significant than that. And the fact that she was human herself was something most people on the station had not noticed or had chosen to ignore. Marin had been watching Ren since before the girl had even applied to the Academy. And she was watching now with the careful attention of someone whose entire long-term operation depended on what happened next. She made a note in a file that was encrypted with protocols far above Academy clearance level. Subject performing above projected parameters, the note read. Recommend continued observation and removal of administrative obstruction if subject's trajectory is artificially interrupted. She paused and added one more line. The catalyst hypothesis may be valid. 3 weeks after the arena fight, the Academy announced the Crucible, the defining event of the first year, a massive multi-day wargame that would determine squad rankings and individual advancement, and for the lowest performers, formal expulsion review. Teams were assigned by the Commandant's office, and when the assignments were posted, Ren found her name listed as team leader of Squad 9. The squad roster was a list of every bottom-ranked cadet in the Academy: Pip, the Milok, the Davi, the Luri, and 25 others who the system had written off before the year even began. The Commandant had not assigned Ren this squad by accident. He had given her the worst possible team, the weakest possible hand, the clearest possible setup for a failure so complete and public that no one would ever question the rankings again. Ren read the roster, and then she read it again, and then she closed the screen and looked at the wall of her tiny storage room quarters, and the ghost of a smile that had appeared in the arena came back to her face. Because the Commandant had made the same mistake that Viral had made, the same mistake the whole galaxy kept making when it looked at humans. He had measured what her people were born with instead of measuring what they refused to accept. And he had just handed her a squad full of cadets who had nothing left to lose. The jungle moon was a nightmare wrapped in green. The Crucible Arena was a real planetary body, a dense, humid moon orbiting a gas giant at the edge of the training system, and the Academy had seeded it with sensor towers and observation drones, and enough simulated hazards to make 72 hours feel like a lifetime. 12 squads of 30 cadets each were dropped at separate landing zones around the moon's equator, and the rules were layered and unforgiving. Capture territory, hold strategic points, eliminate opposing squads through simulated combat tags, and survive long enough to reach a final objective that would only be revealed at the 48-hour mark. The winning squad's leader would receive a massive rank advancement and the recognition of the entire Academy, and the losing squad's leader would be formally recommended for expulsion review, and everyone understood that this second rule had been written with one specific human in mind. Squad 9 landed in the densest part of the jungle, which was either bad luck or deliberate placement, and Ren did not waste time figuring out which because it did not matter. She gathered her 30 cadets in a tight circle under the canopy, and looked at their faces, nervous Grith with trembling sensor hairs, blind Milok pressing their forelimbs against the ground to read the vibrations, Davi whose enormous dark-adapted eyes were squinting against the dim light that filtered through the leaves, Luri who stood perfectly still and recorded everything they saw with memories that would never fade. These were the rejects, the afterthoughts, the cadets that every other squad leader in the Crucible would dismiss as easy targets. Ren saw something else entirely. Every other squad is going to fight this like a war, she said, keeping her voice low enough that only her cadets could hear. They are going to mass their forces and take territory and hold positions and clash with each other in big dramatic battles because that is what they were trained to do, and that is what the ranking system rewards. She paused and looked at each of them in turn. We are not going to do any of that. She laid out what she called the Ghost Doctrine, and it was unlike anything the Academy had ever seen in a Crucible exercise. Squad 9 would not hold territory because holding territory required strength they did not have. Instead, they would move constantly, traveling at night when the Davi could see perfectly, and every other species was half-blind, using the Milok to dig hidden tunnels between key positions that no scanner would detect, relying on the Grith sensory web to map the movements of every other squad in real time. They would not engage in direct combat, because direct combat was a game designed for species bigger and stronger than they were. Instead, they would set traps and steal supplies and feed false information, and hit targets from angles that no one expected and vanish before anyone could respond. They would be ghosts, and the jungle would be their home. And by the time the other squads realized what was happening, it would already be too late. The system ranked us last because we do not fit the way it measures strength, Ren told them. That is not a weakness, that is our biggest advantage, because no one is prepared for something they have never seen. Pip's sensor hairs were vibrating so fast they were almost humming, and the little Grith looked up at Ren, with an expression that Ren had learned to read as fierce, determined loyalty. "Tell us what to do," Pip said. Ren told them. The first 18 hours of the Crucible played out exactly as Ren had predicted. The top-ranked squads surged forward and claimed territory and began building defensive positions and clashed with each other at the contested boundaries. And the jungle echoed with the sounds of simulated combat and shouted orders and the general chaos of conventional warfare. Squad 9 was nowhere. The observation drones tracked them for the first few hours and then lost them entirely when the squad moved into the dense undergrowth, and the Milok began digging, and the faculty observers in the orbital command center exchanged confused glances because an entire squad had simply disappeared from the battlefield. Commandant Dreth watched the empty sector on his display and felt a small, cold uncertainty settle in his stomach, which he promptly ignored. At hour 20, Squad 9 hit for the first time. Squad 7 had set up a supply depot in a clearing near a river, guarded by 6 sentries, and they were confident in their position because they were ranked 4th overall, and their sentries were Keshari and Torvan cadets with excellent night vision and combat instincts. They did not have Grith-level vibration sensing, and they did not know about the tunnel that the Milok had spent 4 hours digging directly underneath their supply cache. The tunnel opened at 2 in the morning. Davi cadets poured out of the ground in perfect silence, moving through the absolute darkness under the jungle canopy like water through cracks, and they tagged every sentry before a single alarm was raised and stripped the supply depot of everything useful and vanished back underground in under 3 minutes. Squad 7 woke up to find their supplies gone and their sentries tagged as eliminated, and nothing but tunnel entrances in the dirt that had already been collapsed behind the raiders. They had no idea who had done it. At hour 31, Ren executed her masterpiece. Squad 3 was ranked 2nd overall and led by a massive Torvan cadet named Dren, who had modeled his entire strategy on the traditional Torvan doctrine of overwhelming force and fortified positions. And his squad had taken the largest territory on the map and was preparing to push outward and absorb the weaker squads around him. Ren had been watching him through Pip's sensory network for over a day, and she knew his patrol routes and his shift changes, and the exact location of every sentry, and the blind spots in his perimeter that he did not know existed because his species did not think in terms of blind spots. They thought in terms of walls, and walls were only useful against enemies who played by the same rules. Squad 9 hit Squad 3 at 3 in the morning from 4 directions simultaneously. Davi Night Raiders from the north, Milok tunnel teams from below, Grith sensor jammers disrupting their communication network, and Ren herself leading a 5-cadet strike team straight through the one gap in Dren's perimeter that he had considered too small for any meaningful force to exploit. It was over in 11 minutes. Dren's entire command structure was tagged and eliminated before most of his squad even woke up, and the big Torvan stood in the wreckage of his command post, staring at the small human woman who had just dismantled his army in less time than it took to eat breakfast. He was silent for a long moment, and then he said something that no Torvan had ever said to a human in the recorded history of the Union. "Well fought, Commander." Ren nodded and disappeared back into the jungle. By hour 40, the other squad leaders had figured out that something was very wrong, but they could not agree on what it was because Squad 9 never stayed in one place long enough to be identified, and their attacks came from directions that did not make sense, and the sensor data was being scrambled by Grith interference patterns that the standard equipment could not filter. Viral, leading Squad 1, was the only leader who understood what was happening. He had studied Ren, and he had studied humans, and he recognized the doctrine she was running because he had read about it in the Earth archives. It was called asymmetric warfare, and it was what humans did when they were outgunned and outmatched, which was most of their history, and it was devastatingly effective because it turned every assumption the stronger force held into a vulnerability. He adapted, pulling his squad into a tighter formation, and changing his patrol patterns randomly and posting Grith-sensing countermeasures. And for 12 hours he and Ren played a tense cat-and-mouse game through the dark jungle, each of them probing the other's defenses without committing to a full engagement. At hour 44, they met face-to-face at a river crossing. Neither of them was alone, they each had a small escort, but neither side moved to attack, and for a strange, suspended moment they just looked at each other across the shallow water. "You do not fight like a soldier," Viral said. "Soldiers lose wars," Ren replied. "Survivors win them." Viral studied her for a long moment, and the blue light pulsing beneath his skin flickered in a pattern that Ren could not read, but that meant something like reluctant admiration. He turned and led his squad away, and Ren did the same, and neither of them could have explained why. At hour 48, the final objective was revealed. A massive alert blared across every squad's communication system. A simulated doomsday weapon had been activated at the geographic center of the moon, and it could not be disabled by any single squad, and the only way to shut it down was for at least 4 squads to simultaneously hold 4 separate control points arranged in a ring around the weapon's location. It was a cooperation test disguised as a war game, and it blew the entire exercise wide open. Every alliance that had formed in the first 2 days collapsed instantly, because cooperating meant trusting rivals and trusting rivals meant vulnerability, and no squad leader was willing to be the first to lower their guard. Ren saw it immediately. The final objective was never about tactics or combat. It was about leadership, real leadership, the kind that required convincing enemies to work together when every instinct told them not to. She sent encrypted messages to 3 other squad leaders proposing a temporary alliance: Squad 11, Squad 5, and Squad 1. 2 responded within the hour with cautious agreement. Viral did not respond for 6 hours. When he finally did, his message was 2 words: "Send coordinates." The final assault was chaos and precision woven together. 4 squads that had been trying to destroy each other 24 hours ago, now moving in synchronized formation toward 4 control points, and Ren coordinated the entire operation from the most dangerous point: the southern control station closest to 3 hostile squads that had refused to join the alliance. Her squad held that point against 2 separate counterattacks, while the other 3 squads locked in their positions, and the weapon's countdown timer dropped to single digits before the 4th and final point was secured. The timer hit 0 and stopped. The crucible was over. When the composite scores were calculated, territory held, objectives completed, squads eliminated, leadership metrics, cooperation bonuses, Squad 9 finished first. The lowest-ranked squad in the academy had won the most important exercise of the year, and they had done it without a single advantage that the ranking system recognized, using abilities that the system had classified as worthless. Led by a cadet, the system had placed at the very bottom of the list. In the orbital command center, the faculty observers sat in stunned silence, and Commandant Dreth stared at the final scores on his display with all the warmth of a glacier. He pressed a button on his console, and a message was sent to Ren's personal terminal, a message that arrived even as her squad was still celebrating on the surface of the jungle moon. It was a summons to appear before the Commandant's office, alone, to answer formal charges of conduct, unbecoming a cadet and manipulation of academy exercises. The penalty, if found guilty, was immediate expulsion. Ren read the message, and the celebration around her faded into background noise, and she stood very still in the humid jungle air, and understood with perfect clarity that winning had never been the hard part. Surviving what came after winning, that was the real fight. The tribunal chamber was a cold room built for cold decisions. It sat at the top of the academy's administrative spire, a circular hall with walls of dark polished stone, and a raised platform where the senior council members sat behind a curved table that looked down on a single standing position in the center of the floor. That position was designed to make whoever stood in it feel small, and for most species it worked. Ren Vasquez stood in the center of the floor and did not feel small because she had stood in worse places and faced worse odds, and the people staring down at her now were not the most dangerous things she had ever looked in the eye. Commandant Dreth sat at the center of the council table, his armored body so large that his chair had been specially constructed to hold him, and his ancient crustacean eyes were fixed on Ren with an expression that was not anger but something more final than anger. It was the calm certainty of someone who had already decided how this would end. The charges were read aloud by an administrative officer: unsanctioned tactical doctrine, exploitation of regulatory gaps in the Crucible exercise framework, conduct disruptive to established academy culture, and failure to adhere to the combat methodologies approved by the Faculty Combat Board. Every charge was vague, and every charge was designed to be impossible to disprove, because they were not really charges at all. They were a door, and the Academy wanted to push Ren through it and close it behind her and forget she had ever existed. Ren was given no advocate because the regulations did not require one for cadets below a certain rank threshold, and her rank was still frozen at the bottom, where the administration had locked it weeks ago. She was expected to stand alone and accept the verdict and disappear quietly, which is what every other inconvenient cadet in the Academy's long history had done. The first council member began speaking, a Shareth professor whose crystalline voice chimed with practiced authority as she outlined the case against the human cadet, and her words were measured, and her logic was elegant, and her conclusion was predetermined. Then the door opened. Viral Sonterk walked into the tribunal chamber without invitation, and without permission, and without any indication that he cared about either. He was tall enough that his entrance changed the geometry of the room, and his bioluminescent veins were pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm that every Keshari in the room recognized as the formal pattern of truth-speaking, a signal that what he was about to say carried the weight of his bloodline behind it. "I request to address the council," he said. Commandant Dreth's eyes shifted to Viral, and something flickered behind them. Surprise, maybe, or the first crack in a certainty that had seemed absolute 30 seconds ago. "This proceeding does not require outside testimony," Dreth said. "This proceeding is attempting to expel a cadet for winning," Viral replied, "and I believe the council would benefit from the perspective of the cadet she defeated." The chamber was silent. Dreth could have refused, but refusing a Keshari heir's formal truth-speaking request in front of witnesses would create a diplomatic incident that would reach his superiors within hours, and so he gestured with one massive claw for Viral to speak. Viral did not look at the council when he spoke. He looked at Ren, and there was something in his gaze that had not been there in the arena or in the jungle, something that had grown slowly over weeks of watching and studying, and reluctantly understanding. "Cadet Vasquez defeated me in single combat using techniques I had never encountered," he said. "I have reviewed the fight extensively, and I can confirm that she broke no rules, exploited no illegal advantages, and employed no forbidden methods. She simply fought in a way that I was not prepared for, and the reason I was not prepared for it is because no one in this academy, or in my species' 12,000-year military tradition, has ever thought to fight the way she does." He paused. The charge of unsanctioned tactical doctrine is therefore not a charge. It is a confession by this institution that it encountered something new and did not know how to classify it, and rather than learning from it, the institution chose to punish it. The Shareth professor's crystals chimed in agitation, but she did not interrupt. In the Crucible exercise, Viral continued, Cadet Vasquez led the lowest-ranked squad in this academy to first place using a strategic framework that the scoring system did not anticipate, because the scoring system was built on assumptions about how war is supposed to be fought, assumptions that Vasquez proved were incomplete. And if the purpose of this academy is to train leaders who can win real wars against real enemies who will not follow our assumptions, then punishing the one cadet who demonstrated exactly that ability is not discipline, it is cowardice. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. A Keshari air had just called the academy's leadership cowards to their faces, and the ripples of that word spread outward through the chamber and through the corridors beyond, and through the entire station. Dreth's claws tightened on the edge of the table, but he did not speak. The door opened again. Pip walked in, 6 legs clicking softly on the stone floor, and behind Pip came the Milok cadets and the Davi cadets and the Luri, and behind them came Dren, the massive Torvon squad leader whose army Ren had destroyed in 11 minutes. And behind Dren came cadets from species that had never spoken in defense of a human in the recorded history of the Galactic Union. They did not ask permission to enter because they had decided collectively that this was more important than permission. One by one they spoke, and each one said essentially the same thing in different words. Ren Vasquez had not cheated or manipulated or corrupted the system. She had simply been better than the system expected a human to be. And if the Academy expelled her for that, then the Academy was admitting that its rankings were not about ability, but about species. None of them had been asked to come. Ren had not sent a message or made a request or even known this was going to happen, and she stood in the center of the chamber listening to aliens she had known for barely 2 months speak for her as though she mattered, and something inside her that she had kept locked down tight since the fringe colonies pressed against the inside of her chest like a fist trying to open. The last person to enter was a woman most of the cadets had never really noticed. A minor liaison officer assigned to human integration concerns who kept to the background and filed quiet reports and never drew attention to herself. Liaison Marin walked to the center of the chamber and identified herself, and when she spoke her voice carried an authority that did not match her supposed rank, because her actual rank was considerably higher than anything listed in the Academy's records. "I am an operative of Union Strategic Command," she said, and the chamber went very quiet. "My assignment for the past 4 years has been the evaluation of human integration into Union military structures, and I am authorized to share the following classified findings with this council." She activated a holographic display that filled the air above the chamber floor with data, charts, graphs, operation reports, statistical analyses spanning nearly 3 decades. "Since humanity's admission to the Galactic Union 28 years ago," Marin said, "every joint military operation that has included human officers has shown a statistically significant increase in mission success rates. Not marginal increases, but transformative ones. Improvements of 30 to 40% in operational outcomes across every theater and every mission type." She let the data hang in the air. "The reason is not that humans are stronger or faster or more gifted than any other species in this union. By conventional metrics, they are among the weakest sentient species ever admitted, and the ranking systems used by this academy and by the fleet accurately reflect that conventional measurement. What the ranking systems do not measure," Marin continued, "is the effect humans have on everyone around them. Humans destabilize predictable outcomes. They force adaptation. They refuse to accept frameworks that they did not choose. And when they are embedded in a unit or a command structure, they do not just perform their own role. They make everyone around them perform differently, think differently, fight differently. She looked directly at Dreth. In strategic terms, Commander, humanity is a catalyst species, not powerful on its own, but capable of transforming every system it touches. And the cadet standing in front of you today has demonstrated that quality more clearly in 2 months than any human operative I have observed in 4 years of active evaluation. Marin stepped back and the holographic data faded, and the chamber was left in a silence that felt different from the silences that had come before, heavier, more final, loaded with the weight of a decision that everyone in the room understood would echo far beyond this single tribunal. Commandant Dreth sat behind his curved table and looked at Ren Vasquez. He was old and he was traditional, and his species had been building fortresses for longer than most civilizations had existed. And every instinct in his ancient body told him that the system was right, and the rankings were right, and the way things had always been done was right. But he was not stupid. He looked at Ren, small and battered, and standing in a room full of aliens who had come to speak for her without being asked. And he saw something he had not seen in decades of running this academy. He saw a leader who made everyone around her more dangerous. The silence stretched for a long time, and then Dreth spoke. Charges dismissed. The chamber erupted, not in cheers but in a release of tension so vast it was almost physical, a collective exhale from dozens of species who had been holding their breath without knowing it. Dreth raised one massive claw, and the room went quiet again. I am also ordering, he said slowly, as though each word cost him something. A formal review of the Academy's cadet ranking methodology, the first such review in 3,000 years, to determine whether our current metrics accurately reflect the qualities this institution claims to value. He looked at Ren one final time. You are dismissed, Cadet Vasquez. Ren saluted, a human gesture that no one in the room was familiar with but that everyone somehow understood. And she turned and walked out of the chamber, and she did not look back. The new rankings were posted 4 weeks later. The pillar of light in the grand atrium still displayed 6,012 names, but the numbers beside them had shifted in ways that the old system would never have produced. Pip was no longer in the bottom 100. The Milok cadets had jumped 1,000 places. The Davi and Luri had climbed into the mid-ranks, where their abilities were finally being weighted alongside the combat metrics that had always overshadowed them. Ren was no longer last. She was not first either, and she would not have wanted to be, because being first meant the system had a place for you, and Ren had never been interested in fitting into someone else's place. She was somewhere in the middle, surrounded by cadets who had been written off and were now climbing, and that felt more like a victory than any number could have provided. On the observation deck that evening, Viral found her looking out at the stars. He stood beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke, because they had moved past the need for words about some things, and arrived at something that was not quite friendship, but was close enough to stand next to in comfortable silence. You know they will keep trying to stop you, Viral said. Good, Ren said. That is how I know I am going the right direction. Viral's bioluminescence flickered in the pattern she had learned meant amusement. Where did your species learn to be like this? He asked. Ren thought about it for a moment, thought about the fringe and the cage matches and the hunger, and the years of being told by the galaxy that humans were small and short-lived and unimportant. And she thought about every human who had ever been knocked down and gotten back up, not because they were brave, but because getting back up was the only thing they knew how to do. We did not learn it, she said. We just never figured out how to stop. 3 months later, the next year's incoming class arrived at Thalrin Prime War College, and among the new cadets walking through the grand atrium for the first time, There were more humans than the Academy had ever admitted in a single year. 17 of them, from Earth and the colonies and the fringe. Each one of them small by galactic standards and psionic null, and short-lived, and utterly unremarkable by every metric the old ranking system had ever cared about. A young human cadet with wide eyes and shaking hands looked up at the pillar of light and searched the names and found one she recognized. A human name, sitting in the rankings alongside Keshari and Torvon and Shareth, and every other species that had once seemed untouchable. The young cadet stood a little taller. Somewhere above, in a corridor that overlooked the atrium, Ren Vasquez paused on her way to class and looked down at the new arrivals and saw that young cadet standing straighter. And she understood in that moment that the most important thing she had done at this academy was not defeating Viral, or winning the Crucible, or surviving the Tribunal. It was proving that the latter was not as tall as they said it was. The galaxy had spent 10,000 years measuring worth by what a species was born with, by the gifts coded into their blood and the power written into their bones, and it had never once thought to measure the one thing that mattered more than all of that